The old woman was standing in the hotel lobby with one small suitcase beside her. A security guard held the door open. "Ma'am, you need to leave." She looked past him toward the marble reception desk. The CEO of the hotel stood there in a tailored black suit. He had just pointed at her suitcase. "She doesn't belong here." The woman looked at him calmly. Then she reached into her worn leather handbag and pulled out a small brass key. She placed it on the reception desk. "That is interesting," she said, "because this building belongs to me." Her name was Margaret Bell. She was 71 years old. For most of her life, Margaret had lived quietly in the same Midwestern city where the Bell family had operated a small furniture business. She never dressed like a wealthy woman. That morning, she wore a gray wool coat, simple black shoes, and a faded blue scarf. The hotel was another matter. The Bellmont Hotel stood 12 stories above downtown. Its lobby had marble floors, brass elevators, and a chandelier that had cost more than Margaret's first house. For the past 6 years, the hotel had been operated by a company called North Star Hospitality. Its chief executive was Daniel Reed. Daniel was 44. He had built a reputation for turning old properties into luxury hotels. The Bellmont had been his biggest success. At least, that was what everyone believed. Margaret had come to the hotel that morning for a simple reason. She wanted to see the building. Her late husband Thomas had helped purchase the property decades earlier. After his death, Margaret had kept the original ownership records in a safe deposit box. She had not visited the hotel in nearly 10 years. But recently, she had received a letter from the county property office. The letter contained a detail that bothered her. North Star Hospitality was listed as the operator. But the deed still showed a different owner, Margaret's name. She decided to see the property for herself. She walked into the Bellmont shortly after 10 in the morning. At first, nobody recognized her. The receptionist asked if she had a reservation. "No," Margaret replied. "I'm only here to look around." The receptionist looked at her coat, then at the expensive lobby, then back at Margaret. She quietly called security. Within minutes, Daniel Reed came down from his office. He looked at Margaret from across the lobby. "Can I help you?" "I believe so," Margaret said. "I'm Margaret Bell." Daniel's expression changed slightly, but only for a moment. "I know the name." Margaret smiled. "Then you know why I'm here." Daniel did not answer. Instead, he told security to escort her outside. Margaret did not argue. She simply picked up her suitcase. Before leaving, she looked once more at the marble floor beneath her feet. Then she walked out. That afternoon, Margaret went to the county recorder's office. She requested the complete property file for the Bellmont Hotel. The clerk brought out a thick folder. Inside were decades of documents, original purchase agreements, property tax records, renovation permits, mortgage releases, and finally the deed. Margaret studied it carefully. Her name was there, so was Thomas's. The deed had never been transferred to North Star Hospitality. Margaret turned to the clerk. "Has anyone filed a transfer?" The clerk searched the system. "No." Margaret asked for the tax records. For 6 years, North Star had been paying the property's taxes. That was unusual. But paying taxes did not automatically make them the owner. Margaret took copies of everything. Then she found something else, a document filed 4 years earlier. It was an operating agreement. North Star had been managing the hotel under a management contract, not owning it. Margaret returned home and opened an old metal box. Inside was a stack of letters from her husband. One letter was dated March 14, 2016. Thomas had written, "Daniel wants a long-term management agreement, nothing more. We are not selling the building." Margaret read the sentence twice. Then she remembered something. Thomas had never trusted Daniel with ownership. The next morning, Margaret contacted the attorney who had handled the original hotel purchase. His name was Robert Hayes. He was 82 and retired. Margaret found his old number. He answered on the 4th ring. "Margaret?" "Robert, I need to ask you about the Bellmont." There was a long silence. Then Robert said, "I wondered when someone would finally ask." He told Margaret that Thomas had refused to sell the hotel. The agreement with North Star was only a management arrangement, but there was a problem. Robert's original client file had disappeared years earlier. The physical file was no longer in his office. Margaret felt the first real setback. Without that file, she had fewer records proving what Thomas intended. Robert searched through old computer backups. Nothing. Then he remembered something. Thomas always kept copies. Where? Robert thought for a moment. At the hotel. Margaret returned to the Bellmont that afternoon. This time, Daniel refused to meet her. She asked for access to the hotel's old records. Security refused. She left empty-handed. For 2 days, nothing happened. Then Robert called. I found something. An old email archive had been recovered from a backup drive. It contained a message from Daniel to Thomas. The subject line read, Bellmont Management Agreement, Final Terms. The email said North Star would manage the hotel for 10 years. It specifically stated that ownership would remain with Thomas and Margaret Bell. Margaret printed the email, but she still needed the original signed agreement. Robert remembered where another copy might be, a storage company used by his old law firm. They searched through several boxes. Most contained tax records and closed cases. Then, inside a brown envelope marked Bell, Hotel, they found it, the original agreement. Signed by Thomas Bell. Signed by Daniel Reed. And witnessed by Robert Hayes. Margaret looked at the final page. There was no sale, no transfer, no purchase, only a management contract. But Daniel had spent 6 years presenting himself as the owner. Margaret took the documents to a new attorney, Laura Bennett. Laura spent nearly an hour reading everything. Then she placed the papers neatly on the table. Margaret, this is not a misunderstanding. Margaret looked at her. What is it? Laura answered carefully. North Star appears to have been operating your property under a management agreement while presenting itself as the owner. She pointed to the original contract. This document matters. Then she pointed to the county deed. And this matters even more. Margaret asked what could happen next. Laura explained that they could demand the company's records, notify the county, and seek immediate control of the property. But we should be prepared, Laura said. Daniel isn't going to hand over a 12-story hotel because we asked politely. Margaret nodded. I don't want his money. Laura looked up. What do you want? Margaret answered simply. My building. 3 weeks later, Daniel received a formal demand from Laura. The letter included copies of the original deed and management agreement. It requested that North Star recognize Margaret's ownership and provide a complete accounting of hotel revenue. Daniel responded through his attorneys. He claimed the original agreement had been replaced by a later arrangement. But when Laura requested that document, Daniel produced something unexpected. A contract dated 2018. It appeared to transfer ownership to North Star. Margaret looked at the copy. The signature looked like Thomas's. Almost. Laura sent it to a document examiner. The result came back 6 days later. The signature was not original. It had been digitally reproduced from another document. And the paper itself had been printed years after the date shown on the contract. That changed everything. Laura requested the hotel's electronic records. Emails, accounting files, document creation histories, payment records. The metadata showed that the supposed 2018 ownership contract had been created in 2023, 5 years after the date printed on it. One email was particularly damaging. It was from Daniel to his finance director. The subject was, Ownership Documents. The message contained only one sentence. Make sure the old management agreement doesn't appear in the lender's file. Laura showed it to Margaret. Margaret sat silently for several seconds. Then she said, So he knew. Laura nodded. He knew. The matter was brought before the appropriate state court for a formal determination of ownership and control. On the day of the hearing, Daniel arrived with 3 attorneys. Margaret arrived with Laura. She carried the original agreement in a plain brown folder. Daniel's attorneys argued that North Star had invested millions into the hotel. They argued that the company had maintained the property, paid taxes, hired employees, and built the Bellmont into a profitable business. Laura did not dispute any of that. She simply returned to the question of ownership. Who owned the building? The original deed answered that. Margaret Bell. Then came the disputed 2018 contract. Laura presented the forensic report. The document had not existed in 2018. Its signature had been reproduced. Its file history pointed to a computer used by North Star's legal department. Daniel sat quietly. Then Laura presented the original management agreement. The witness signature belonged to Robert Hayes. He testified that he had watched both Thomas and Daniel sign it, and he remembered the conversation afterward. Thomas had told Daniel, "The building stays in the family." Daniel had agreed. The final piece came from the county records. There had never been a legal deed transferring the Bellmont to North Star. The building had never belonged to Daniel. It had been Margaret's property the entire time. The ruling restored Margaret's ownership rights. North Star was ordered to turn over the hotel's financial records and surrender control of the property. The questionable 2018 document was referred for further investigation. Margaret did not celebrate. She simply sat beside Laura and held the original deed. Afterward, Daniel approached her in the hallway. For the first time, he looked less like a CEO and more like a tired man who had run out of answers. "You could sell it," he said. Margaret looked at him. "I could." He waited. She continued, "But I'm not selling it to you." Then she walked away. 8 months later, the Bellmont Hotel had a different sign above its entrance. It no longer carried the North Star name. Margaret had hired a new management company. She kept most of the staff. The old receptionist stayed. So did several of the housekeepers and maintenance workers. Margaret visited every few weeks. She never changed the marble lobby. She kept the brass elevators. And in a small office overlooking the street, she placed Thomas's original photograph on the desk. The building was no longer something she remembered from another lifetime. It was hers again. One evening, Margaret stood alone in the lobby after the last guests had gone upstairs. The chandelier reflected across the polished floor. She reached into her handbag. The old brass key was still there. She turned it slowly between her fingers. Then she placed it beside Thomas's photograph. And for the first time in many years, Margaret looked around the building without wondering whether it would still belong to her tomorrow. It did.